This video tells a story and it offers a real conclusion to that story. I believe you won't regret watching it until the end. Once, you were the good girl, the polite one, the quiet one, the one who held it all together. At first, this role seemed to work, until it didn't. Until the silence began to sting. Until the smile felt like a mask. Until you realized that being good was costing you the most important thing, you. This isn't about rebellion. It's about breaking the silent rule that says you only deserve love if you're easy to manage. If you've ever smiled through humiliation, apologized when your heart was screaming, or laughed politely while your chest tightened, then perhaps the story was meant for you. You were the girl who cleaned up without being asked, who stayed silent when adults spoke, who instinctively held her breath to keep the atmosphere from shifting. You could feel the tension before anyone voiced it, and you made it your job to ease it by simply shrinking. It started with small corrections. Don't be so loud. Why are you so emotional? You're overreacting. Each comment, though subtle, chipped away at you, dismissing your feelings under the guise of casual observations. Gradually, you learned to read the room before speaking, to adjust your energy so others felt at ease. You learned to make yourself smaller, lighter, easier to manage. You didn't disappear all at once. You disappeared slowly, inch by inch, through softened opinions, swallowed discomfort, and acts of grace that no one asked for, but everyone expected. You became the easy one, the agreeable one, the one who never stirred the pot, who never asked for too much, who blended seamlessly into the background. But here's the truth. That flow was never designed for you. You've just become remarkably skilled at swimming in it, unnoticed. Now, when something hurts, you hesitate. When something's unfair, you translate it into understanding. When you're angry, you smile. You begin to wonder, why do you feel so disconnected? Why does your joy feel borrowed? Why does your voice sound rehearsed, even when you're being honest? It's because you've lived too long in a script that was written for someone else's comfort. Perhaps the reason you feel invisible is that being the good girl has cost you your most authentic self. This isn't about blame, it's about remembering. Because underneath the perfection, the emotional control, and the practiced politeness, there's a voice that was never meant to disappear. The birth of the good girl. Before you could name your emotions, your body already knew what was acceptable and what was too much. Long before language, long before memory, there were reactions, micro-adjustments. When you raised your voice, the tone shifted. When you asked for more, the atmosphere chilled. More attention, more space, more truth. No one needed to explain the rules. The nervous system interpreted them effortlessly, not through logic, but through pattern. A glance, a sigh, a distracted face. These were all it took. You learned that connection wasn't unconditional, it was earned. The currency? Compliance. You didn't need to be punished, you just needed to notice which parts of yourself brought warmth and which parts made the room go cold. Slowly, silently, the good girl was born. Not out of obedience, but out of intuition, a survival mechanism dressed as personality. Winnicott's theory, the emergence of the false self. Donald Winnicott called this the emergence of the false self, a survival adaptation for environments where a child's full emotional truth is too much to bear. It's not deception, not even conscious. It's relational intelligence, the instinct to preserve connection at the cost of self-expression. Later, Gabor Mate would describe this split as a fracture between authenticity and attachment. And when those two are in conflict, the child chooses attachment every time. You didn't stop feeling, you just learned to filter, to soften the edges, to regulate intensity before it arrived. You became fluent in preemptive translation, editing your feelings into acceptable formats, not out of manipulation, but necessity. And no one saw it happening because you never made it obvious. The thing about subtle adaptation is that it hides in warmth, in smiles, in silence, in being easy to raise. Psychologists like Bowlby and Ainsworth showed how children learn to suppress emotion not because they're emotionally weak, but because they've adapted to caregivers who couldn't attune to their emotional needs. The result isn't emotional emptiness. It's emotional overregulation, disguised as maturity. The signs aren't dramatic. They're in the small shifts. The way you held your breath before speaking, the way you paused before sharing a feeling, the way you waited for others to finish their reactions before confirming your own. These weren't strategies, they were instinctive. Your body calibrated itself in real time, storing every signal, every rejection, every moment of too muchness trimmed into a quieter version. Your emotions didn't disappear, they were archived, tucked beneath performance, beneath balance, beneath your reputation for being calm. You weren't lying, you were adapting. And this adaptation became automatic. Eventually it felt like your identity. You forgot what it was like to react in real time, to feel without scanning the room first. Because safety for you was never about being held. It was about being manageable. The less friction you created, the closer you could stay. You learned to associate love with lightness, presence with pleasantness. And over time, anything outside that frame started to feel like danger. The good girl wasn't born in one moment. She was assembled slowly, through 1,000 small edits, through tone, through tension, through silence. And by the time she was fully formed, no one questioned her. They praised her. But beneath the praise was a trade. You offered up your emotional range in exchange for approval. You became fluent in other people's comfort. So fluent that you stopped noticing your own discomfort. And that's how the good girl survives. By staying readable, agreeable, and slightly invisible. Your nervous system remembers. Your body holds every interruption, every moment you held back. It remembers, even if you don't. You learn to stay quiet, but your throat tightened each time you swallowed the truth. You smiled when things felt wrong, but your jaw held the tension long after. You sat still, polite, appropriate, but your chest carried the weight of everything you didn't say. The performance looked seamless, but inside, the nervous system was recording everything. Not just events, but reactions, the pattern of restraint, the rhythm of self-erasure. This isn't just poetic language, it's biology. Neuroscience has shown that unexpressed emotion doesn't disappear. It localizes. It settles into breath, posture, muscle tone. The body becomes a map of avoidance, an archive of edits. A glance might not feel like a wound, but the body registers it. A sigh, a cold response, a withheld gesture. These micro-traumas accumulate, not as memory, but as tension, as hyper-awareness. You begin to scan faces before you speak. You rehearse sentences internally, editing them for impact. Not because you're insecure, but because your safety has always depended on how well you can read a room. This is not anxiety in the clinical sense. It's relational vigilance. A nervous system trained to detect emotional weather before it changes. You weren't taught to listen to yourself. You were taught to attune to others, to moods, to needs that weren't yours. Psychotherapist Pete Walker defines fawning as a trauma response, alongside fight, flight, and freeze, where the instinct for survival takes the shape of appeasement. It's not kindness, it's not empathy. It's the unconscious strategy of staying safe by being agreeable, useful, emotionally convenient. The child doesn't rebel or withdraw. She adjusts. She anticipates needs, offers comfort before it's requested, and edits herself down to the most acceptable version. Not to manipulate, but to preserve connection in environments where authenticity felt risky. And so the body adjusts quietly, repeatedly, until these adjustments no longer feel like reactions. They feel like personality. You don't call it fear. You call it being thoughtful. You don't call it pain. You call it sensitivity. You don't call it dissociation. You call it being observant. But your body knows the truth. It flinches in stillness. It braces before you enter a room. It contracts slightly when someone asks, "Are you okay?" Because you're never sure how much of the answer is safe to give. You don't fall apart. You hold everything in, and that holding becomes habitual, invisible, prey. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory explains how our nervous system constantly scans for safety. For many girls, the path to safety is through emotional compliance, a form of internal freeze that isn't visible on the outside, but there is a cost to holding it all in. Over time, the body doesn't just store suppression, it normalizes it. What once felt like effort becomes default, and what once was self-protection becomes self-abandonment. You forget what relaxation feels like. You forget how to speak without filtering. You move through your life composed, controlled, and completely disconnected from your center. Judith Herman calls this the trauma of chronic adaptation. Not the kind that comes from a sudden rupture, but from repetition, from subtle, persistent shaping. Sylvan Tompkins described it as effective deprivation, the slow starvation of emotional truth. And when your truth has nowhere to go, it turns inward. It becomes fatigue. It becomes overthinking. It becomes a life that looks fine but feels hollow. This isn't weakness, it's pattern. A pattern that the nervous system built to protect you. And if the body remembers pain, it also remembers possibility. The path back is not dramatic. It's small, slow, a softening in the chest, a sentence spoken without apology, a moment of rest without justification. These don't seem like triumphs, but to a system built on vigilance, they are acts of re-entry, signals that safety might no longer require silence. If something in this felt familiar, share it in the comments. Sometimes naming it is the first step back to yourself. And if you want to keep exploring these layers with me, remember to like the video and subscribe quietly on your own terms. No performance needed when praise becomes a cage. They weren't praising your freedom, they were praising your predictability. It sounded harmless at first, so well behaved, such a calm presence, always easy to be around. But beneath those compliments was a quiet directive. Stay consistent, stay agreeable, stay small. You weren't being seen, you were being managed, and the management came wrapped in approval. What looked like encouragement was reinforcement. Each nod of approval trained you to prioritize comfort, not yours, but theirs. You weren't rewarded for being real, you were rewarded for being convenient. This isn't discipline in the traditional sense. There were no raised voices, no harsh punishments, only repetition, a rhythm of reinforcement that taught you exactly who to be to stay included. And once the formula was clear, you didn't question it. You stayed within the lines. You performed calmness. You delivered emotional ease. Not because it was natural, but because it worked. The subtle shaping of the self. It's subtle, this kind of shaping. It doesn't silence you overtly. It teaches you to self-regulate before disruption ever occurs. Over time, you internalize the gaze of others. You begin to anticipate expectations before they're spoken. That anticipation becomes instinct, and instinct becomes identity. Praise became the leash. The more you were celebrated for being adaptable, the harder it became to notice when you were actually uncomfortable. You learned to translate your discomfort into service, your tension into politeness. You mastered the art of appearing composed while suppressing the urge to dissent. And because everyone liked this version of you, you began to protect it at the expense of anything that felt inconsistent with the image. But this is not love, it's containment. According to Stephen Porges, neuroception is the nervous system's ability to detect safety or threat before the thinking brain is involved. This explains why a child learns to read a room before she learns to read words. A slight shift in tone, a pause in someone's breath, a glance that lasts too long. None of it goes unnoticed. Her body registers it, adapts in milliseconds, and stores the pattern. It's not intuition, it's biology. It's the autonomic system doing what it was designed to do, protect her, even at the cost of her spontaneity. They didn't praise your curiosity, your disruption, your edge. They praised your ability to smooth what was rough, to fold the parts of you that complicated the atmosphere. And every time you complied, the cage got a little quieter, a little softer, until it didn't feel like a cage at all. It felt like a compliment. But when praise only comes in exchange for predictability, it stops being affirmation and becomes a contract that demands you stay legible, pleasant, non-threatening. Any deviation, a strong opinion, a need, a change of pace, feels like betrayal, not because it is, but because you were trained to prioritize consistency over honesty. The quiet cost of adaptation. The consequences aren't always dramatic. They live in the hesitation before speaking your mind, in the way you second-guess your preferences, in the quiet fear that saying no will make you unrecognizable to the people who love you. Because what they loved wasn't your wholeness, it was your containment, your capacity to regulate emotion without spilling, your commitment to peace, even when it cost you clarity. They didn't mean harm, but impact isn't measured by intention. And when recognition is tied to control, affection becomes a performance, a mirrored version of yourself that reflects everything others want to see, while you disappear just slightly in the process. You begin to wonder, who would I be without the applause? And maybe the scarier question is, who am I if I stop performing? You're not fake, you're fluent in survival, but fluency isn't freedom. At first, adapting felt intuitive. You adjusted tones, softened reactions, measured presence. It wasn't strategy, it was instinct. A quiet, skillful reshaping of yourself in response to whatever the moment required. That sensitivity kept you safe, connected, included. But over time, something shifted. What began as temporary flexibility turned into default behavior. And slowly, you stopped noticing where the performance began. Donald Winnicott called this the emergence of the false self, not as deception, but as protection. A version of the self designed to fit into a space that could not hold the original. The erosion of the self. This self is functional, articulate, socially aware. It earns affection, diffuses tension, maintains the script, but it is also incomplete, constructed through omission rather than expression. You weren't trying to hide, you were trying to belong. And when belonging seemed conditional, you gave up the parts of you that complicated it. Not because you didn't care, but because you cared enough to compromise again and again until compromise became character. There's a moment, often invisible, when adaptation stops being conscious and starts being structural. When the curated version of you becomes so practiced, so polished, that even you begin to believe in it. You don't just play the role, you inhabit it. It's not a mask you remove at the end of the day. It becomes your reflection. And that's where the real loss begins. Not in expression, but in access. You no longer reach for what you want. You wait to see what's needed. You don't form opinions, you attune. Your reactions don't come from within. They arise in response to context. You don't lie, but you edit so thoroughly that the truth loses its shape. Eventually, you're not sure what you would say if no one were listening. Not because you have nothing to say, but because your voice has always been a translation. This erosion isn't loud. It doesn't scream for help. It moves like fog. Quiet, persistent, covering everything in a thin layer of vagueness. You become known, but only an outline. Relatable, but not reachable. Present, but missing. And it's hard to explain what's wrong because nothing seems broken. You function, you contribute, you perform empathy, composure, strength. But inside, you carry the quiet fatigue of never being fully arrived. This isn't about being fake. It's about long-term adaptation without renewal. When every room shapes you and none of them reflect you back, identity becomes diluted. Your preferences feel borrowed. Your desires become theoretical. Even rest doesn't restore you because you're still translating, still making sure you're legible, acceptable, aligned with expectations you never chose. The shift back to authenticity. And yet, there's a moment, a pause, a conversation, a quiet rupture where something flickers, a subtle resistance, a sentence you didn't edit, a truth you let land without buffering. It feels unfamiliar, maybe even wrong, but also alive. That flicker isn't rebellion, it's return. A return not to who you were before adaptation, but to the version of you that never had space to unfold. A self not built for acceptance, but for wholeness. A self that doesn't need to earn space or prove softness or translate constantly to be received. The false self kept you safe, but it cannot carry you home. Because home isn't where you're most praised, it's where you're most known, living in a furnished life that isn't yours. Everything works, but nothing carries your imprint. The lights turn on, the schedule flows, the conversations unfold politely. From the outside, your life appears intact, structured, coherent, well-maintained. But inside, there's a soft misalignment, a quiet sense that what surrounds you was assembled without asking who you are. It's like living in a furnished apartment where nothing offends, but nothing belongs. The walls are clean, the pieces fit, the routine functions, but it's all slightly removed from you. The decor reflects someone's taste. The layout reflects someone's logic. You move through the rooms, but they don't echo back your presence. Everything is in order, but none of it feels lived in. And the most disorienting part is that nothing is wrong. That's what makes it hard to name. You keep showing up. You're dependable, available, composed. You play the part so well that it stops feeling like a performance. It just becomes your rhythm. But somewhere along the line, spontaneity thinned out. Desire became filtered. Presence was replaced with repetition. This isn't a collapse, it's a quiet fade. Not a dramatic departure, but a gradual loosening of the thread that connects you to your life. You laugh when expected, respond appropriately, function without friction, and still, you can't shake the sense that you're watching your own life happen from just outside the frame. There's food, work, maybe even love. But what's missing isn't content. It's contact, not with others, but with yourself. And often, that distance doesn't feel tragic. It just feels normal. What would I be if I stopped responding? In attachment theory, John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth describe anxious attachment as a pattern that develops when care is inconsistent, sometimes warm, sometimes withdrawn. The child learns that love must be managed. She becomes emotionally vigilant, tracking every shift in tone, every delay in response. Her identity forms around preserving the bond, being pleasant enough to stay close, contained enough not to be rejected. She doesn't ask for reassurance. She performs for it. And even when connection is available, it rarely feels secure. You've built a life in reaction, not through chaos, but through calibration. You don't move from desire. You move from detection. You track tone, temperature, tension. You don't enter a room. You merge with it. And somewhere along the way, that merging became the map. Not an overlay, but a substitution. You don't ask yourself what you want. You wait to see what's needed. You don't form opinions. You attune. Your thoughts are just mid-sentence, shaped by the facial expressions of whoever's in front of you. And it's not dishonesty. It's a refined survival instinct, one that works so well, it goes unnoticed. But there's a cost. Over time, you stop knowing what would emerge if no one else were in the room. You stop trusting your own momentum because everything you say is passed through a filter. Every reaction trimmed for fit. Every sentence revised mid-thought. You're not pretending, you're translating, and the original keeps getting lost in the edit. There's no collapse, no outburst, no breakdown, just a quiet unraveling. A slow erosion of the internal reference points that used to tether you to yourself. You're not silent, but you've stopped speaking from the center. You're not invisible, but nothing lands with full weight. And then, in a moment that doesn't look important, a missed call, an afternoon alone, a simple question that doesn't land where it should, the doubt appears. What would I be if I stopped responding? Not reacting, not adapting, not pleasing, just originating.